Welcome, esteemed viewers. I'm Tom Martin. With me is Jason Methfessel. We recently visited the Southwest Audio Fest. We went to 30 or 40 different rooms and saw a lot of interesting equipment. We're going to cover some of what we thought were highlights, which may mainly be things that were new to us or we hadn't heard before. We'll try to concentrate on some things that sounded particularly good, but I want to stress that it's really not possible to do a best of show or really do ratings or rankings because the rooms are different and ancillary equipment is different, and there's just too much that we don't completely know when we're there. So we want to highlight things that sounded interesting or good to us. Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. If you enjoy our videos, you might also like our other work for audiophiles and music lovers: written equipment reviews, editor's choice ratings, product news, and music reviews. Get the latest each week with a free subscription to our email newsletters. A link is in the description. So, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason, and can you pick one of your highlights and just kind of walk us through what you saw and what you heard?
Well, on Friday, it kind of took a little bit for a lot of the rooms to kind of settle in. So I didn't really make note of too much and kind of took a little bit of more of a forgiving perspective on the day. But we did get to end that day with kind of a private audition of the Songer audio speakers. Open baffle, single driver speaker. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about it was this merging of handcrafting along with kind of a little bit more of a technological take on something that seemed a little bit old-fashioned.
Yeah.
It had a very elegant design, solid wooden front baffle, and then the coil?
Field coil.
The field coil technology, something that I was previously unfamiliar with. It had a very particular sound. I found it quite enjoyable. It was very intentionally voiced, but I mean, I had that Latvian radio big band track on Girl in the Tree, and as I was kind of going through different tracks to really kind of draw out what the speaker had to give, and the way it presented the horns on that track was, sometimes horns can be a little harsh in those initial transients, and it was very subtle and really, really enjoyable. I kept wanting to push the next button to get to my next track, and my finger just kept lifting up and just wanted to listen more. So
cool. All right. Let me talk a little bit about one of my highlights, which was a bit of a surprise to me, the Zeloton Plural Evo. It was driven by Solution Electronics, a Solution preamp and a Solution power amp, and we also had an airtight cartridge on board, so it was a pure vinyl demo. Something that I noticed often works quite well when you're using really high-quality turntable or cartridge phono preamp setup. But the Zelotons, they look pretty normal. I mean, you can look them up. It's a 3-way, 2-woofer box speaker with some unusual cabinet shaping. It's a medium to large size box speaker with cone drivers. Okay, cool. But the sound stage was wide and deep. The sound space that it created was exceptional. And the dynamics on some of the tracks that were played was really impressive. Chick Corea album, Return to Forever Returns, has a track that's very drum forward. And honestly, I think it was about as close to the sound of live drums, which we've both experienced in concert, as almost anything I've heard. There's a tendency for some impressive dynamic speakers especially to overdo it a little bit, and it catches your ear, but then you think back, that's not actually the way it sounds. But this was really close to the sound of live drums, and the rest of the spectrum was nicely balanced on the other tracks that were played, and it's definitely a speaker that I want to hear again.
Yeah, it was interesting because I don't typically listen to a lot of vinyl, as you know, but again, the one of the best vinyl presentations at the show. And again, an airtight cartridge. I don't think that's coincidence.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be. All right, what's your next one?
So next on my list was some electronics from CS Port together with some Stenheim speakers, kind of going on the artisan and looking beautiful kind of vibe as with the songers. The CS Port monoblock amps were, I don't know.
Jason actually said that he thought his wife would go for these amplifiers, and there were 4 amplifiers, I believe, on the floor of the listening room.
Yeah, each channel has 2 separate pieces with one massive tube in each. And yeah, there was something about that glow in that room that just, there was a relaxed feeling that kind of set in with the Stenheims, and as the music just kind of emanated from those speakers, it just sounded so well put together, just really balanced in a way that was engaging, rather dynamic. Yeah, it was just kind of another one of those rooms where I just kind of wanted to sit there and keep listening to the music, and at an audio show, that I feel like that's saying something.
That's pretty unusual, yeah.
So.
And I've heard Stenheims with different electronics, and they don't always leave this impression, so I came away with a very positive view.
There's something there.
There's a there. My next one is going to sound like it's in a similar category to this, and that is, we heard the Rockport, were they the Lynx?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the boulder, in the room with the boulders, yeah.
So, not small, but a smaller speaker than I'm accustomed to from Rockport. I've had a number of people talk to me about Rockport, and they come highly recommended, and I've never heard them sound as good as this demo did. I do want to mention, you can't figure out when you're listening to a system what is causing what to happen. But Boulder was showing a new Class A pair of monoblocks together with these Rockports, and you just have to wonder if it isn't, again, a little bit of magical combination. But the sound was relaxed and pure and natural without being dead or lifeless or somehow feeling like it was tweaked or modified. It just sounded right, and I was quite impressed. And, well, you know who's recommended Rockport to us, and I've had my questions about it, and wow. Yeah, this was a really good demo.
Yeah, it sounded good, and, we from time to time we'll have conversations about the system and how a lot of times it's really, there's a temptation to get into figuring out one component in that system. And I think that's one of the things about shows, is that going into it with kind of that mentality of individual components, it makes me want to try and, like, when I hear a room that sounds good, it's like, well, what component in here is making this sound good, instead of kind of panning back a little bit and just being like, wait a second, okay, there's a whole system at play here.
Maybe it's everything.
And,
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned it before, but we talked about turntables and vinyl being used in setups. In this one, it was an MSB DAC, I believe. Mm. And again, I had to wonder, is that actually part of the story here? You look at the new amplifiers and you're like, Class A, Boulder, okay, maybe that's what's going on, but maybe it's the whole thing. And there were some cables we had never even seen before being used. It's hard to attribute things to specific components, like you're saying. All right, what's next for you?
Next is Clarisys Audio, together with the block amps, soon to be reviewed. As an audiophile who appreciates a little bit of meat in the bottom end, panel speakers always sound wonderful, but there's always just that little bit lacking. And this seemed to be kind of a year for panel speakers, but the Clarisys Audio, the Studio Plus is what they had on demo there, just blew me away. I mean, the rich bottom end, the clarity that you get from a ribbon speaker, the room filling sound, it kind of was the whole package. Admittedly, the bass might have been a little unnaturally lifted, but I think they would have admitted that too. I think they recognized that the speaker kind of overpowered the room a little bit.
The room was probably too small for the speaker, or the speaker was probably a little bit too big for the room, and that meant that we couldn't get very far away from the wall behind us, and you're almost always going to have a bass lift there. But talking about bass lift with a dipole speaker is a really unusual conversation, because the dipole roll-off means you almost always have not enough bass in the bottom octave or octave and a half, and here we had plenty, and it was dipole detailed and clear and... Yes. And I think the soundstage and sound space were pretty impressive too. Again, in a room that was probably a little bit too small for the speaker to really show its stuff in that department, but there was a level of depth there that was very impressive. Yeah,
and the control over the like you could feel the control that was at play there.
Yep, we'll be covering a little bit later in summer some of the theories of how bass works and why dipoles work well and other ways to get to that kind of bass. But the Clarisis was something special. All right, my next one was the room with von Schweikert speakers, JMF electronics, and Idion front end, digital front end, streamer and DAC, both by Idion. You and I have talked about this, and I think we're of one mind, so viewers ought to take that into account. But there's something about the voicing of the von Schweikert speakers that really, I think, works for some people. And I would say it's not unlike what I hear Rockport trying to do, and that's a little bit more closely match the something like the recommended 1 dB per octave tilt in the sound. It's what you measure when you measure the sound in a hall, and it's what perceptual research shows is what people want. And I feel like von Schweikert is really in tune with that approach. And yet, for someone who doesn't think of himself as I like lifted bass and I like a little bit of treble roll-off, I'm probably almost the opposite kind of guy in terms of what I would buy for myself. The von Schweikerts almost always sound pleasing and good and enjoyable, and they cross some threshold into that world of where you stop listening to the audio gear and start listening to the music, and I think that's kind of the right place to be. Back to your systems comments, this is also a consistent thing with JMF electronics, and again, there might be a there too. So something good is going on with the combinations that these guys tend to show up with, but the von Schweikert speakers, I think, are really worth a listen. And I made a mental note and want to see if we can get some of the Idion front end gear in to see if they're doing something special. We talked to the designers last year at Munich, and they're complete nut jobs when it comes to digital processing. So there may be something going on besides Ouzo in Greece.
Yeah. My past experience with the von Schweikerts was like, I was intentional about making that my last stop on Saturday before we left the show, because I wanted to finish on a relatively high note, and I knew that they wouldn't let me down. And I think that speaker's great, having the powered bass. It gives you the control. So, you know, if that lift is a little too high, you just turn her down, and it really was an enjoyable system.
Yep. All right, what have you got?
So, Capital Audio Fest, I believe Acora debuted the MRB, their bookshelf.
And it's really a whole line of,
it is,
for them, entry-level products, although they're not inexpensive.
Line. Yeah, the MRC series is kind of a whole line of more entry-level speakers for them, and the MRB is their stand mount, and I didn't make a point to listen to it at Capital, so I kind of made a beeline for their room on Saturday to get a listen, and that speaker really surprised me. It has a lot of that familiar Acora sound, but for that speaker's size, it plays so much bigger than that. It's kind of incredible how room-filling such a small speaker can be. Definitely stood out to me, for sure.
Yeah, I think I remember the demo I didn't hear them at Southwest, But at Capitol, I remember the demo, and that was a small speaker in a very large room that had no trouble filling the room.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a speaker that we definitely need to get in and check out in more detail. And they were with VAC Electronics, as they often are, and I think once again, that's likely to be a factor in total system synergy kind of thing.
Yeah.
My next one is a speaker that I actually have a little bit of history with, or a company that I actually have a little bit of history with, but it's new to the U.S., and that is a company called Popori, and they are an electrostatic loudspeaker manufacturer. I believe they're based in Poland. They have some fairly traditional but nicely designed looking speakers in their conventional line, but they've introduced a new product, and this is called Hypersail.
Hypersail.
So these speakers are called the Hypersail, and the reason, which you could probably see on screen right now, is that they are shaped like a sail with a hard edge on one side and a big curved edge. And I believe that's to distribute or break up the resonant modes of the panel. So it's a styling thing for sure, and I think the reaction of people at the show was that it's an interesting looking speaker, but the reason for it is actually an underlying technological benefit. I would say the Poporis have a classic electrostatic sound where you sense the clarity without it seeming etched or unnatural. I've always attributed that in part to electrostatic speakers lacking hysteresis. There's not a magnet operating in here. Also, interestingly, the Hypersails come with subwoofers, and so Popori has addressed the dipole roll-off in part by equipping them with subs. They are separate subs, so you have some placement flexibility, and the crossover is very low at 55 hertz. So you're really just getting the bottom octave and a half maybe on the sub. Of course, it's not a brick wall roll-off, but it's mostly dealing with the very bottom region where any reasonably sized panel is going to roll off, and instead of trying to do unnatural acts, they've put a sub in. And honestly, I listened to the things for 3 or 4 songs before I even noticed that the subs were there. A lot of the rooms in a show, as you know, and people who have gone to shows will know, a lot of the rooms in shows are very darkly lit, and I didn't notice that there were subs there, and there was no sense from the audition that a separate subwoofer was playing, but the bass sounded nicely balanced without that thing that I think some speakers 10, 20 years ago really tended to do, which was, I've got a sub, so I need to play it loud enough for you that you know you paid for a sub and that you're getting a sub and that we have bass. It wasn't like that at all. It just seemed to be an integral part of the music that was being played.
Yeah,
So,
it was very seamlessly integrated, and if you can make a sub disappear, it's an accomplishment.
they're pretty close. All right. Have you got something else?
I don't think so.
Cool. All right. At this point, we'd like to mention one thing that is kind of important. There are companies, and I'm really glad that they're there, who regularly bring their flagship products to a show because they've found, and almost every manufacturer will agree with this, that you get better traffic and better reaction if you show at the high end than if you show at the entry level. And I want to mention 2 manufacturers who had very nice rooms and did an outstanding job, but this is our 4th or 5th time around the block with these products, and so I want to mention them, but not always make them the front end of the coverage that we do. So the 2 rooms that I want to mention are, first of all, YG. YG showed the big double tower $500,000 speaker system, and they were in an unusual room. It was large for one thing, but it had one curved wall and one straight wall, so you really had to ask yourself how they managed to make it sound good. But they did a very nice job of making the speaker sound interesting and powerful. They paired the speakers with Tycho, Streamer, and DAC, which is something we saw in a number of rooms, and I think that's a kind of a new thing. And then they had a new Soul Note prototype amplifier with higher power, but they were bi-amping the speakers, so they had the lower power Soul Note monoblock and this new higher power version. And again, wanting to potentially give credit where credit is due, that whole Tycho to Soul Note to YG front end and back end may have had something to do with how they pulled off what they pulled off in challenging room big time. And these are big speakers, so they needed a big room. I can understand why.
Yeah, the shape of that room was a definite challenge, and to see what they were able to put together in that room was some impressive sound for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, and that the Tycho digital source components, I think there's something there, because we heard them as well in Scott Walker's Estelon room, another room that impressed yet again. Got a chance to listen to some tape in there as well, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, the whole package in the YG room was quite pleasing.
Yep. Scott Walker, as you said, put on an impressive demo. He often brings Estelon, but the addition of tape to the discussion is another one of those you realize how important the front end is. Tape is expensive. There's not a very wide selection, but boy, yeah, it's a little bit of once you hear it, there's no going back. So that was another big system demo that was really impressive. And then the final one, which, I tend to mention it in almost every show report, that did its outstanding things, but you sort of end up putting it in the category of, oh yeah, it's just a Ferrari, until you think a little bit for yourself. It was the MBL room. So MBL had the 101Xs on display, bi-amped with 9008 amplifiers and an MBL front end. Jeremy did not bring tape this time, thankfully, but they again did their amazing soundstage and sound space thing in what I think was a nicely sized room for that speaker, and with some reasonable amount of acoustic treatment. So they definitely showed well.
Yeah, my first time hearing the 101Xs and the sound stage and space, it was overwhelming. It was quite impressive. And the room was large, but unfortunately he was combating the HVAC system for the entire hotel on the opposing
always something
wall.
Special at a
and again with challenging rooms in both of these demonstrations from these top tier brands, and they're still able to put an incredible sound together. It's quite remarkable.
Yep. So that's what we saw at Capitol Audio Fest that stood out in our minds. That's not to say that's everything that was amazing, and we're bound not to have gotten to some rooms, for which we apologize. If you've been to audio shows, you'll know what I'm talking about, but sometimes the layout of the hotels is complicated and tricky, and you just don't happen to go down a hall and make a right turn and then a left and then a right again and find out that there's somebody back in the center of the hotel or something like that. So we missed some things for sure, but it was a good show. Really enjoyed it, and highly encourage you to get to an audio show near you if you can. And we hope you've enjoyed this coverage of the Southwest Audio Fest, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching.